He was America's most beloved and trusted pediatrician, with millions of parents following his instructions for caring for babies and children. So the January 5, 1968, federal indictments against Drive. Benjamin Spock and 4 other Vietnam War opponents stunned the nation. The New York Times and the Washington Post gave the story front-page play. The men, accused of conspiring to urge people to violate draft laws, earned so much notoriety that they even had a nickname, the Boston Five. But most people cared only about the fate of Spock, whose seminal work, The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, first published in 1946, had become the foundation of American parenthood. "Don't be afraid to kiss your baby when you feel like it," Spock urged mothers and fathers, who had been warned for decades to withhold physical affection from their children. Was the federal government really going to imprison the 64-year-old baby doctor because he'd allegedly encouraged young men to resist the Vietnam draft? And what about Spock's 4 alleged co-conspirators? Would the Johnson administration lock up a Yale chaplain, who was a former CIA operative, a Harvard graduate student, a former aide to President Kennedy, and a New York writer? The answer was yes. The government was cracking down. Spock and his cohorts were accused of violating a section of the Universal Military Training and Service Act, which dated to World War I, and declared a person guilty if he knowingly counsels, aids or abets another to refuse or evade registration or service in the armed forces, according to press coverage of the indictment. Spock, who'd embraced nuclear disarmament as a cause in 1962, was an early critic of the Vietnam War. He believed the U.S. was illegally waging war in Southeast Asia and that it was his patriotic obligation to oppose it, even if it meant risking his iconic status. "My own belief is that this was a totally outrageous and abominable thing that the United States had been carrying on," he would testify at his trial. "I felt strongly that the United States had lost its leadership of the free world and that the United States was now despised by hundreds of millions of people who used to believe in the United States around the world." The Johnson administration, empowered by the 1964 Tonkin Gulf Resolution that gave the president authority to take all necessary measures against attacks on U.S. forces, was gradually escalating American involvement in Vietnam. In 1965, Johnson eliminated the draft exemption for married men. A rush to wed to avoid the Vietnam draft, the day LBJ eliminated the marriage exemption. In 1966, 1967 and 1968, the Selective Service drafted 300,000 men a year, according to Michael Foley's book, Confronting the War Machine, Draft Resistance During the Vietnam War. By 1968, the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam was estimated to be about 500,000. The government felt compelled to quash any threat to its military imperatives, even if it meant making the bespectacled Spock the face of treachery. But the draft resistance movement was also surging.